So we've been talking about shifting kind of from all of the human and social dynamics side of things. And we're right about the midpoint of the semester, so it's time for our mid-season refresh on our Gundam style mecha. We get the mid-season upgrade. Typically we get a new OP, so intro, theme song, and credit sequence in the anime that is Forestry Recreation Management at SIU. And so we were talking through just all the different classes of resources, physical resources, that we're responsible for managing, specifically in forest recreation management, because it necessarily requires all of the other disciplines of forestry, and then added into that all of the human dimensions of management as well. So we're going to continue that discussion on what's kind of the characteristic set of any particular national parks resources along all of those different classifications or types of bins that we sort them into, and then importantly, what are some of the interactions between them. So already we've alluded to, in order to have vista resources, you have to have mountain ranges, and you have to have clear air, and you have to have infrastructure, trails or roads to get people up to that mountain ridge, to be able to see off of that mountain ridge and over the curvature of the earth, right? So to get more than about 70 miles of visibility in your view shed, you got to be up above the curvature of the earth. So this is, kind of an outworking of, in the history of forest recreation management, or just the history of being a human on this planet. Back in the late 1400s, people like Christopher Columbus were observing that if you looked at a sailing ship at maximum distance on a very clear day, the bottom of the ship would get cut off by the curvature of the earth, and you could still see the crow's nest, the tops of the sails, and the high masts. And that was sort of the first supposition, at least in Western culture, after the Greeks identified it like 2,000 years before, like Epimenides, guys like that, okay, this physical characteristic, the shape of the earth, the curvature of the earth, in the case of the folks in the 1400s, and the topography of the earth more locally, in the case of our national parks. Those things combine to give us physical line of sight to certain things and not to others, right? So all that to say, viewshed is a combination of topography and air quality and infrastructure and so on and so forth to get that resource of vistas, to get the opportunity to enjoy that resource and value it and experience it as a human recreationist. So it can get kind of complex. There's a lot of interplay between all these different classes of resources. Just to have a good view, you got to be managing your airshed well, but you also have to have all of your neighbors who are upwind, up airshed of you, managing their air quality really well as well, right? So at Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which was a bunch of the infrastructure resources around that, like the I-40 corridor, just wiped off the face of the map with that with the hurricane rains from Helene. There's a lot of coal-fired power plants upwind of Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and we'll see if we can't dig up some photos and videos of the visible smog band that is right at the altitude of humans standing on top of that ridgeline. Have you guys ever been to Great Smokies? All right. If your eyes started to burn and water a little bit as you're standing on top of the Appalachian Ridgeline, where any of those where the Appalachian Trail runs, or where any of the highways sort of crest the mountains and drop down the other side. There are a couple of highways that bisect or chop in half Great Smoky Mountains National Park. You've experienced that air quality resource impact at Great Smokies. So we finished off last Wednesday's class talking about Haleakala National Park as just one case study, just one example park that has a whole bunch of these different kinds of resources and so forth. So I went ahead and pulled it up on Google Earth. So this is the island of Maui, and this is approximately north is up-ish. It's about like that. So again, so that sort of figure eight shape In the entire eastern lobe of this, we've got the West Maui Mountains, all right? A bunch of high erosion off-road motorcycling and dirt biking happening on those ridges. I got to consult on a little bit, but there's not much they can do about that to make that more sustainable. On the east half, however, we've got a big chunk of the center of the east half is this volcano, right? The entire east half of the island is the volcano. And the Hana Highway, which runs along this east coast here, so this is the windward or the wet side, lots and lots of rain. We've got the dry side looking like the surface of Mars up here at the peak. That's like a 70-mile drive, something like that. It takes like 6 hours. It's a highway that takes many hours to drive to get from any of the big sort of touristy towns like Haleakala, Hulu, down towards Hana and Kaupo, or Kaupo. And the reason is you are driving along the flank or the skirt of this enormous 30,000 foot tall volcano. And so there's a whole bunch of winding in and out. The road is iso-elevational, and it just takes a long time to get anywhere on that side of the island, because you have to drive around a whole ass mountain to get anywhere else. Okay? So, just with a couple of the points of interest, you can get a sense of what that drive kind of looks like, right? So we've got lots of waterfalls, lots of gulches, which are very steep, erosionally formed, but typically very small-scale canyons. So with a 10,000 foot elevation change in relatively few miles, from the top of the mountain down to the bottom, and dozens of feet of rain per year, plural dozen, we have a whole bunch of the erosion potential, right? So this soil is just cinder and ash. It's basically very fine aerosolized pumice. It's extremely abrasive. I went through a pair of vulcanized rubber Vibram sole hiking boots in 10 days here. It was almost flat by the end of that 10 days hiking around and taking measurements with the Park Service and stuff like that. Okay? So, Waimoku Falls, very popular, beautiful spot, and so forth. So, the actual national park, the section that everybody thinks about is this section up here. All right, it's about 3 miles by 7 miles. Okay, so fairly big valley, and inside of this, we can see there's a whole bunch of sub-prominences, smaller cinder cones, as the hotspot of the magma plume moves as the tectonic plates drift across it, right? We get this string of either full-size Hawaiian islands where they breach the surface, or on a much smaller, faster scale, we get individual cones popping out. Okay? So, this is up here, up at about 10,000 feet, is the Haleakala Visitor Center, and then we mentioned that world-class, but also kind of problematic from a cultural perspective, Haleakala Astronomic Observatory Complex. Okay. And as you can see, the parking lot up to the top here is just this, right? You're looking at individual cars, not an enormous thing. And Haleakala National Park gets up to a couple of million visitors a year, right? So the infrastructure resource here, the topographic resource here, the vista resource here, I'll show you a couple of videos and pictures of what the sunrise looks like up here, pretty amazing, can lead to a lot of demand. And just briefly, at the beginning of our discussion about it last week, we talked about this little island in the middle of this tiny little parking lot just being absolutely Swiss cheese or chopped apart, or again bisected by a whole bunch of little trails, right? So if a visitor walks from this car up to the observatory, and it's like the middle of the night, right? 2 or 3 in the morning to get up there before the sunrise at that elevation. And each one of these clusters of slightly more white pixels is one of those ahina, the native Hawaiian silver sword plant, which is extremely culturally important to them. They make, or in the past, native Hawaiians have used parts of individual ahina to make part of like the garb or the vestments, the raiments of their royalty. So that's like super important for them. This would be like, gilding the furniture in the Oval Office, for example, right? But they do it with these plants. And visitors, when they come to the national park, are just walking all over this stuff, right? So there's this experiential resource that folks are trying to get to, see the beautiful sunrise in this freezing cold weather and high winds and so forth, and totally unprepared. And the Park Service can't put a bunch of lights up there so people can see where they're going, because the whole point is the dark night skies with literally a world-class astronomical observatory system right over the way, like 300, 400, 500 yards away. So it's tough. But you can see, just looking out, like when you're looking out east over the ocean, it would be like this direction here, right? You got nothing else to contend with, right? You're looking out into space, and the sunrise is popping up, and if the cloud ceiling is at a mile in the sky, you're a mile above that, right? It's a beautiful, beautiful sort of island in the sky sensation to see the clouds flowing by a mile beneath your feet, so to speak, and sort of parting and flowing as a fluid around this beautiful spot. So, a world-class experiential opportunity, and a very rare one, and relatively difficult to access. So, very, very high demand, very high pressure. When we were talking about the distribution of use, we were talking about the density of use, or high use density. So, lots of people in a relatively small area is different than lots of people in a very large area. It's not just the number of people, it's how tightly they're all clustered together. Okay? So, what this leads to is a whole bunch of, let's see where we go, back to the map. So, forgive me this picture quality. This is on a 15-year-old digital camera, and 15 years ago, this was like the summer before the iPhone 1 dropped. So it's not amazing stuff, but this is what the sunrise looks like. And you can see how there are a lot of people clustered real close together, partially just for body warmth because it's absolutely ridiculously cold. And people are jammed in that tiny little Summit Observatory building, right? And so everybody oohs and ahs for the sunrise. Everybody takes that selfie, some people propose, and so if you can kind of see right here, this is where the clouds are thousands of feet below us. Pretty cool spot. You can get the same experience at Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It's smoky because the clouds are constantly blowing across the Appalachians at that particular latitude. But here, it's built different, as they say. This would be the Rizzler sunrise viewing opportunity. I'm sorry. I'm a little sorry. I'm not actually sorry at all. All right, so these are the ahina, and we don't need to me narrate this twice, but that's that little middle of the parking lot teardrop shape. And there's a whole bunch of, it's hard to see with this super pixelated old camera, but there are lots and lots, dozens of visitor-created trails, dozens, in a tiny little teardrop shape, right where these organisms live. And there are only a few 100,000 of these in the world. And almost all of them are up here on one side of this mountain. So for the National Park Service to take visitors to these sensitive plants, And then, we don't need to see my face, that's horrifying. Golly. What sequence of unfortunate events led to my existence? All right. This is a choice, right? The National Park Service doesn't have to run a road up here at all. If they don't, and visitors suspect that there's a world-class sunrise viewing opportunity up here without the hardened infrastructure to do it, what are the visitors going to do? Figure out their own way up. And a bunch of different visitors are all going to figure out their own ways up. And now we don't have one path up the mountain. We have dozens or hundreds. So, think at your national park, what are the absolutely can't miss it opportunities for your visitors? Not just this amazing and exceptional and extremely culturally significant vegetation resource, viewing opportunity, for example, but the combination of the topography and vistas and infrastructure and so forth, right? So take a second to think, what are the icon sites of my park? This is a question we've asked before, but now we're seeing some more sort of concrete examples of it, right? What are the outstanding and exceptional resources that visitors are going to focus themselves onto? And then out of that list, what are the outstanding and exceptional resources that visitors want to focus themselves onto that the Park Service, you, this semester, have chosen to harden, provide access to, provide information about, kind of advertise? So when you go to the visitor centers down low, there's a bunch of information about what to do up at the summit and how long that drive takes. And could you pay a local tour guide $10, $20, whatever it is, to drive you up so you don't have to futz with a rental car and stuff like that and just have somebody else do the work part of your vacation. Okay? So think about what those might be for your national park. Okay? Then think about what are the dynamics of how people are moving through that space. So let's go back to Google Earth. We know people want to get from this parking lot up to this visitor center. And the path to do it is very indirect. You see how it's coming from way off to one side versus a lot of the people are going to be, they see this, and then we're going to go straight up that little slope right there, right? Very common thing. So humans are adapted or evolved, depending on your theology, to kind of monkey see, monkey do a little bit. That's a slightly cynical way of putting it, but when we see something interesting, we tend to move in a straight line approach towards that thing. So, it's a decision to put this parking lot up here at all. It's another decision to put a visitor center up here. It's a third to put a path in between them, and a fourth on where do we put that path. Do we put it in as steps? No, not since the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? So in the 80s and 90s, we start seeing as architecture, as infrastructure resources have to get replaced, updated, upgraded, repaired, they have to be made accessible to wheelchairs if they're not already. So that means a very, very gentle, shallow slope, for example. So that's why, in this case, the approach trail between the parking lot and the visitor center is way off to the side. Instead of going straight up that slope and, grandma or grandpa like flying back down and litho braking onto the hood of somebody's rental Cadillac or something, we have a much gentler, slower approach. So trail, slope, alignment, angle. We'll talk more about what that is. Those of you on summer camp, you may remember TSA, or trail, slope, alignment, angle. Okay? So, this is tough, right? Visitors are going to want to be up here. And once we put in these roads, they're never going away. We are modifying the shape of the face of the earth permanently, forever, to put these things in. And so once you put them in, people start depending on that. Businesses start building their business model around what would it cost me and how much could I charge for driving people up and shuttling people back down. Okay. So your decisions about how to manage the interface of all of these resources coming together in one spot to be amazing. Really, really challenging. So the entire senior level class natural resources planning, or park and wildland planning, is all about how do we answer these questions professionally. It's teams of people's full-time job at most major national parks to figure out how to answer questions like this. All right, do we got to put in a road? What kind of road do we got to put in? How many lanes? How much do we need to make it switchback? So let's zoom out a little bit, follow the road down the mountain. And it's a little bit faint on this screen, but all right. These are those switchbacks, those hard, almost 180-degree turns back and forth, which make the road 2 to 20 times longer. It's a long drive to get up to the top of this mountain, but you're not actually covering a lot of distance. You are lowering the effective slope that your vehicle's brakes have to experience by increasing the distance, right? So increasing the run makes the experienced rise a little bit gentler, okay? So this is tough. Now, we talked a little bit about how the actual crater system is a couple of thousand feet down below where we were just looking. You can see those not quite vertical, but in some places pretty close. Multiple 1,000-foot cliff walls up to about 2,000 feet tall in places like near Haleakala. So there are multiple trails that drop down into the crater, and because of the soil type, because of this soil resource of this sort of loose, just sort of aerosolized, bubbly lava as it's sort of kind of farted out from the molten liquid inner compartment of the planet, and it hits the air, it cools off as this highly abrasive dust and settles as volcanic cinder, right? So you can see the trails. Some of these trails are almost big enough, almost eroded enough to see from space. Now, if you're a soil scientist, a soils manager at Haleakala National Park, that's a problem with a capital P. Right? That's a relatively stable cinder soil surface. There's not a lot of rain on the side of the island at all, right? A couple of centimeters a year. But our choices to put in trails, this is the only thing causing focused erosion in this entire area, again, in spots just on that threshold of being able to see it from space. Now you think of the kinds of megastructures that humanity has created that are visible from space, things like the Great Wall of China, for example. So to say our soil erosion, specifically for the purpose of bringing a few backcountry or wilderness recreationists down into this valley, that's a spicy meatball. That's a lot of resource impact that is permanent, because we're not mule training that cinder back up to the top and putting it back where it belongs, right? We're just letting it happen at a hopefully pretty controlled rate and saying this is the best we can do, and saying there are inherent management trade-offs to the soil resource relative to the desire, the intense motivation for people to get down into this valley and experience it. And we're just going to have to accept that. So I apologize. There's just a lot of glare from outside. It's a little bit hard to see this, but hopefully you can see some of these switchbacks back and forth. That is an attempt to try and get that water off of the trail so that it's not doing too much of exactly what it looks like it is doing, right? If it looks like drippy paint, that's a lot of soil being moved. In places, when we did a trail erosion cross-sectional area soil loss survey, we measured this trail be shaped like this. Cinder, in terms of erosion, behaves a lot like sand. Not a lot of organic material acting like glue to hold those particles together. Although cinder is the paleo parent material for things like kaolin clay. Kaolin clay is all ancient volcanic soils that have evolved chemically to become sticky when wet. There's not a lot of that going on here. So, it's just loose sand. And so the trail can be 10 meters wide and 5 meters wide down at the bottom and a couple of meters deep. So imagine you're walking down this trail and it's so eroded, so many thousands of dump truck loads of soil just where this trail now is versus how it used to be just that smooth-ish slope, right? This is if this is a cross-section, if you're looking forward along the trail, and this is the shape you see for these downward or inverted trapezoid-shaped profile of the trail as you're walking along it. If this is 2 meters tall, 3 meters tall, you can't see anything, right? The walls of the slit trench that you are walking in, this trail, it's eroded so much that you can't even see what's around you. And it is like that in places, right? So, one dump truck load is about 15 to 16 cubic meters of fill, right? So, this is 10 meters wide, 5 meters wide at the bottom, and then we sort of extrude this shape forward, let's say 10 meters. It is as long as it is wide. So from the top, looking at the outer edges of the eroded trail surface down, we get 10 meters wide by 10 meters tall. Big square that happens to be a trapezoid downward, right? So this would be 10 meters long, walking along the trail, walking along the trail. The area of a trapezoid is the average of the two parallel sides times the depth. So let's say this is 2 meters deep, 7.5 meters. So 15 divided by 2, 7.5 times the height of the trapezoid, 2 meters. We get 15 meters squared times 10 meters, about 33 feet of forward run of the trail. Cubic meters of soil lost. Now it's not gone, it's just further down slope where it shouldn't be. And I'll show you what that looks like down at the bottom and what that means psychologically for the trees or the shrubs trying to grow down at the bottom. Right? So, in 33 feet of forward movement of trail, we've caused, by our feet and our pack animals, 10 dump truck loads of soil transport. In 33 feet, 10 dump truck loads. This is why we're never going to fix this. It's never going to get better. And as you erode this out, and there is any rainfall, or as you erode this out, and people and horses, pack mules, are shuffling a little bit more sand down or cinder down with each step, it never gets better. So this number only goes up. And the bigger this gets, the more space we are mining that surface sediment from and moving it down slope. So this is what we call ecologically a positive feedback cycle. Every time we run somebody down this trail, this number goes up. But the rate of this number going up also increases just a little bit. Okay? So a positive feedback cycle is one that makes it easier or faster or more aggressive or more intense for the next run of the cycle. The next run of the cycle after that is even more fast or aggressive or intense or damaging. Okay? So, to the extent that any of the resource classes that we're talking about, soil, water, vegetation, wildlife, night skies, air quality, water quality, any of these things, to the extent that there are cycles or repeated processes of how we interact with those resources and impact them to any extent, that means next year our job is just that much harder. And the year after that, our job's a little bit harder than that. And this is kind of accelerating a little bit. Okay? So, I'm going to make a pretty big deal about when your park potentially has any erosion concerns. Now, this is literally a top of the global list, or kind of a worst case scenario for trail erosion. This is bad, and you'd be hard pressed to find anything worse, but we can. If you have sort of a dark, cynical sense of humor like me, right? We can do better, but we sure don't want to. And so we now know what the resource is. In this case, at Haleakala National Park, all this topography and soil type and desire to get down into this beautiful, beautiful, isolated and managed for your privacy and solitude wilderness area that's 3 miles by 7 miles. Once you get down here, man, you can go anywhere. So let's go down to the bottom of this trail, the access trail from the, let's see. This is the trail junction where that trail drops down from 10,000 feet down to about 7,000 feet elevation. And there's one really big bush right here. And the whole area is really pretty flat. So it's steep, and then this is cinder soil, so it's steep and then it's flat. Because anything that's steeper than the angle of repose for soil particles is going to get all the way out here and spread out very quickly and easily because cinder particles are very lightweight and easily moved. All right, so we've got this bush right here. This is colloquially known as the pea bush. Does anybody want to venture a guess as to why this single bush is known internationally as the pea bush? Let me realign our view back up the long slope, the very exposed slope. All right. It's a couple of miles from way up here at that visitor center we just saw those videos of, or those pictures of, down to the pea bush right here. And you see how there's a big, wide open space? This is like a 75 to 150 meter, depending on which axis you're measuring, just like clearing that's been trampled clean or sterile, so locally extirpated local vegetation and so forth. Why would this one bush be called and definitely used as the pea bush? You can smell this thing from real far away. It smells like the worst kind of Windex and like hoarder cat pet parent thing, because it is. I mean, not so much cats, but like everybody dumping ammonia, so urea from urine, in this spot. It adds up. There's no rain to wash this stuff out. The solution to our pollution is dilution. Except here, there's nothing to dilute all that urine solid and dissolved urea. So, why would this be? This is totally a human-created problem. Why would everybody choose to pee right here? Let's pan back along the trail up to that point. Remember, folks, I've walked a couple of miles to get to this spot. Why do you suppose everybody would get the same urgent idea to pee at that one bush? It's wide open. It's super awkward, right? You're at 10,000 to 7,000 feet. The air is very clear. There's no haze obscuring like my lily white butt, from potentially hundreds of other people nearby. Everybody with a telescope up at the top, and there's an astronomical observatory, but they're not really posting their telescopes down towards the. Anyway, it's awkward. It's weird. It's socially not acceptable to pee or defecate in public. Now, as a function of being a researcher in this area, have I run across people pooping in the center of the street? Yes. But that didn't make it okay, right? So there's an infrastructure problem here. We have the infrastructure of the trail to address the motivation of wilderness backpackers with a permit, self-supplied, ability to get water and stuff like that, right? They're prepared, but everybody has to defecate and urinate pretty much every day. And this is a wilderness area down at the bottom. So we can't be building outhouses. Now, we do have those 3 cabins. Let's see. Halua cabin, Kapalaoa cabin, I forget the name of the third one. And those do have toilet facilities, but it's another up to 7 miles away walk to each one of those, right? So, humans, the pets that we bring, service animals that we bring, we have basic creature comfort and existential needs, right? We need clean water, we need safe food to eat, we need shelter from the elements. And a storm up here on the wet side is super gnarly. We'll get down to that section of this particular park a little bit later. Okay. So what we're looking at is chemical sterilization by mass urine around that bush. And I say the pea bush kind of ironically because it's actually a tree. And it was a regular looking tree before we, the Park Service, put that access trail down to that spot. There is so many tens of thousands of dump truck loads of soil that we've moved from the top and the middle of that trail down to the bottom of that slope where the pea bush is, that it's filled in 20 feet of that entire section of the valley. And so we're just seeing the top of the tree, right? The bottom 90% of that tree is all under alluvium, erosional deposition material as a function of people hiking down the slope to that spot. So the choices that you have as a Park Service person putting in a trail, how do we route the trail? Is it lots and lots of switchbacks in a relatively small sort of section of the slope? Or is it a long running ramp down? Where do we want to aim this? Where do we want the bottom of this trail to land? Can the ecosystem of that area handle tens of thousands of dump truck loads of soil? Maybe not, right? So, all this to say, we've got our resource, we've got our human motivations on how and why people want to use it the way that we do for forest recreation purposes. That leads to our actual on-site behavior dynamics. That is, just without thinking about it, just walking, kicking a little bit of soil down slope, or loosening the soil enough that the wind can pull it down slope. Aeolian soil transport. Okay? And those motivations lead to those expressed behaviors. Those expressed behaviors lead to the impacts and the side effects. So we know what the dynamics are. How the situation is setting up humans, how the humans are affecting the situation. Now we can talk about the work of a park ranger. What do we do about it? We can shut this trail down. We can close off access to the whole wilderness area. We could require people to helicopter in and out. I mean, that's the choice, certainly. That comes with its own impacts. In fact, helicopters are expressly forbidden by the Park Service and the Federal Aviation Administration from flying over this crater because the air is so clear and thin, and we've got some excellent acoustic reflectors that are up to 2,000 feet tall. All these crater walls. Remember, on Wednesday said this is one of the quietest places on the surface of the planet. There are probably a bunch of quieter caves, but on the surface of the planet, this is like top 3, top 5 quietest in the world that anybody has ever found. So you put a helicopter engine on top of that, and that mechanical whoop, 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 whoop of the rotary blade is pretty loud. In fact, everybody is going to hear it, and everybody's going to think that's a very negative thing, with the important caveat of people absolutely hate mechanical sounds in wilderness. HVAC, motorcycle, fat pipe motorcycles that have been modified so part of the muffler drilled out so they're super loud, right? Even planes. People hate that over a wilderness area, with the one exception of, is it a life flight helicopter? Sometimes you gotta pull somebody out real fast. And in that case, everybody's like, this is terrible, but I'm okay with this. The unstated assumption being, if I needed the life flight out of here, they for darn well better break the silence and chopper my butt to an emergency room for whatever the issue is, right? Okay, so this is what we do. All right. So that's the dry side. This is where a bunch of the lava tubes are, and the lava tubes run out things like Cowpo Gap here, all the way down. So you can kind of lava tube hop from tube to tube and just run down the slope here, all the way from 7,000 feet down to the coast. And people have done that, which is a pretty amazing hike. But if somebody gets lost or hurt in one of those lava tubes, nobody's gonna find them until somebody else gets the idea to check out that same lava tube, right? That might be years later. So, the motivation of humans to use these places in ways that superset or go beyond all of the ways that wildlife want to use these spaces, that makes park rangering interesting and tricky and at times frustrating. All right, so this is the dry side. Pretty cool stuff. Pele's Paint Pot. A whole bunch of these lava crater, a couple of them have lava tubes that you can like look down or climb down into. Pele's Paint Pot, a whole bunch of really beautiful volcanic mineral colors, right? The Andes Mountains down in Peru and Chile have some formations like this. Pretty cool stuff. Kauilinau is the pit that we saw a picture of on Wednesday of last week. It's like 60, 80 feet deep, and they are alerted to a corpse or a cadaver's presence down there by the smell, 80 feet away. Pretty unpleasant stuff to do that. And pretty much every one of these lava cones, if we inspect them, so here's a trail running across the bottom here. People are just wandering across the open, completely unobstructed pumice surface, or cinder surface. So every one of these cones has a trail going to it, and then typically circumnavigating the top. And it's in this area where we saw those pictures of Pyramid Rock last week, where both Native Hawaiians and Tuarans were leaving stuff. And totally okay for the Native Hawaiians, not so much for the Tuarans. On the wet side of this crater, it's completely different, right? It is a verdant green, right? Parts of the TV show Lost, which may predate some of you guys. That was like very early aughts. Anyway, a bunch of that show was filmed around areas like this. Okay, so we got that summit observation area, the road up to it. We've got the wilderness crater area down below that, 7,000 feet, and we've got a section of the park, the Kipahulu Forest Reserve, that is barred from all access to all humans except for a few Park Service staff to monitor and conduct wildlife and vegetation species inventories every several years, right? And then we've got places like Ohio Gulch and Ohio Pools. So this is the third and down by the coast, as you can see, section of the third unit of Haleakala National Park. And here's what it looks like. So we've got Ohio Gulch, again, which is a very small scale canyon, and the Pipiwai stream, Waimoku Falls. It's a beautiful, fun little hike there. And this one little watershed is draining a 10,000-foot mountain in one of the rainiest places on the surface of the planet. Up to here. And so, if you get one of those, almost everyday rainstorms, your catchment basin is pretty big. And it's pretty high energy. You're draining that water off real fast. The problem is, down at Ohio Gulch, where there's a series of beautiful pools fed by this catchment basin, right? So there's a series of 7 pools, and this is the whole last Pacific Ocean right here. People can park at a nearby visitor center and walk a couple of 100 yards over to Ohio Gulch and just take a dip in the water, swim around, and so forth. You're swimming in literal tropical pools fed by waterfalls. So there's these 7 pools. Each one of them dumps into the next through a little waterfall or cascade. I mean, if you're looking for a stereotype of Polynesian tropical paradise, this is literally it. This is the place that people are sold when they're travel agent, for anybody who still uses a travel agent. This is what they're being told. You should go here. It's amazing. Look at these postcards. The problem is, from your low and pretty forested in and down in a gulch vantage point in Ohio Gulch or any of these Kipahulu pools, you don't have line of sight to the top of the mountain, where it's the rainiest place on Earth, or one of the rainiest places on Earth. So it could be storming cats and dogs, biblical level storm, the kinds of storms that destroyed North Carolina, destroyed thousands of homes in Florida, just this past week or two, right? And all that water is real fast flowing down a steep volcano through this one gulch. And so a whole bunch of times, visitors enjoying the tropical paradise and having, fantasies of people in grass skirts, dancing hula or, tiki torch nonsense, whatever, all that stereotypical stuff. And then this 10-foot wall of water just flushes all 7 of those pools in 30 seconds and sort of colon blasts people out into the ocean. And they're dead, right? Because you get tumble cycled right out into the water and, you're bashing your head on the volcanic rocks and all this stuff, right? So, the Park Service has to run a whole bunch of information infrastructure. They've got a whole series of weather engaging stations along this whole side of the mountain to be able to warn people that, hey, a couple hours ago there was a storm like you literally have never seen, you mainlander, and this big pulse, or peak flow for those of you in forest hydrology, it is racing down at very high speed down Ohio Gulch, down into the 7 pools. And it's tragic. It's super unfortunate. All right, so Ohio Pools looks like, let's see here. Here's a black sand beach, so a volcanic sand beach just down the road from there, and lots of people just hanging out. It's a beach. It's pretty cool. There is, this is a fellow researcher named Chris Carr. This is one of the lowest two waterfalls connecting some of the Ohio pools in this Kipahulu area. And that's super fun. He's a rock climber. He was climbing on those rocks, like in the waterfall, and just happier than a bug in a rug doing that. But you don't have a lot of visibility on pulse flash floods racing in, so you can see how this would happen. So it's tricky. The solutions that might work up on the mountain have literally nothing to do with what's going to work way down below. So up on the mountain, no boardwalks. They're going to concentrate people on those badly eroded trails and treat all of those trails as ecological sacrifice zones. Everything's going to be dead around there. And here at the bottom, there is so much life, there is so much verdancy, there is so much aggressive growth and plenty of available water that boardwalks are the thing. The soil is constantly saturated. It's wet. It's right by the ocean, right? The whole South Pacific is able to feed vapor onto this island chain, and it just storms over here constantly. So, boardwalks are the thing. For long sections, unfortunately I don't have good pictures of the boardwalking here, but there's lots and lots of it. And the way that they have to do the boardwalking to physically separate you from, instead of concentrating you onto the soils like they do up in the ashy cinder soils up top, is they're using that recycled soda bottle, the plastic, lumber texture, not at all lumber. Because regular dimensional lumber, even if pressure treated and a rot resistant species, is gone in a couple of years in this kind of regime. It's hot, everything is constantly wet, and it's a breeding ground for everything, right? So we have some difficult issues, and where we don't spend the tremendous amount of human labor and plastic dimensional decking, we're going to see sheet erosion straight through. Every footstep is going to dislodge, loosen up a little bit more soil, and then the rain's just going to wash it away. And so this is where we get a whole bunch of exposed roots. None of these roots grew on top of the soil. There are relatively very few tree species that send out rooting structures above the soil. So where you see this is a clear indication of a mismatch between the ecological resistance of these particular tree species and the soil that they're trying to grow in versus the impact pressure, the use density, according to each activity type allowed here. And it's just going to get worse. And next year, it's going to get a little bit worser, right? Soil erosion is a positive feedback cycle until there's no more topography to move the soil, right? If you erode away an entire hillside or erode a slit trench from one side of a hill through the other side of the trail and it's eroded completely flat, then erosion largely stops in that place and you start getting soil deposition, soil flowing into that spot and piling up there as mud puddles and so forth, okay? So, here, where are we going to afford it? Roll out decking. Roll out more and more and more boardwalking and bridges. Physically separate us, our boot soles, from the forest floor. What do we do about riding your horse in this area? What do you think? Shod horses are going to tear up boardwalking pretty fast, even if it's plastic stuff. So what could be our management strategy out of our fourfold strategies on answering the very valid question of potentially hundreds of thousands of visitors coming to this area every year and saying, I would love to ride a horse through this area? Which of our four strategies could address that? Hint, any of the four strategies could address it. Right? So, pick one, and let's describe or discuss a couple of different tactics under your chosen strategy to deal with the valid motivation of horse travel through hydrant saturated soils, shallow rooting, radial rooting trees. So radial rooting instead of taproot. And the interface between those horse hooves and those roots and soils. What can we do? It's not a trick question. You look back at your notes for strategies and tactics. What can we do? Right.
I'd say limit use, just don't let them on trails that are susceptible.
Limit use. Yeah. Go riding on some of those black sand beaches instead. If you run a horse across sand or cinder, volcanic cinder, the next wave comes and wipes away those hoof prints. No big deal, right? We don't care. That wave action is making more sand all the time. We're not going to run out. Now, in some places where beach recession or erosion is happening, we got to be careful about that. But in this case, we are Gucci. What else? Any of those four strategies could work. We've checked the box on permanent limit use. What else could we do?
Close the trail until it gets fixed.
Yeah. So, say if equity or access is an issue and the horseback riders are mad that the hikers are allowed to use it, we can say, all right, if we can't play nicely together and allow one kind of use, we'll close off hiking too. Yeah, absolutely. What else? What else can we do along the lines of either increasing real or effective supply or modifying visitor behaviors through information and education indirectly or by direct behavior modification like interdiction or fencing? We harden the resource in terms of increasing its resistance to horse impacts. We harden the resource in terms of increasing its resilience from those impacts. What would any of those solutions look like? If we took any of those three other strategies, then limiting use, either just for horses or for everybody. Both valid options.
Really wanted to go for the nuclear option in terms of hardening the resource. You could just pave over it.
You could just pave over it.
But that's definitely kind of a very extreme.
Yeah, but that would, in the words of the movie Office Space, fix the glitch, right? We could armor up Gaia under the plate mail of asphalt. We did that with the road up to the summit, right? That worked up there just fine. Now, most of that road is not through anything living, it's just inert soil, but valid option, right? Awesome. What else could we do? We've got increasing the resistance by armoring up, added to our list. What might something else look like?
You can use the prescriptive, descriptive method.
The proscriptive descriptive method. All right. So we're indirectly modifying visitor behavior through information and education.
Right.
All right. So a proscriptive descriptive message would be a negative message, but not one that is issuing a command. So just let's gin up what that message might be. You could word it a million different ways, but what would a negatively worded descriptive but not command message look like or read like?
If you step off this trail, it can have these impacts followed by a couple pictures.
If you step off this trail, it could lead to impacts like, and we could validly show a photo like this, not from this specific area, but from this national park, of a spot like was looking at them earlier. Let me find one here. This erosion right here was caused by hooves. Now, this is cattle and goats and sheep. That's 5-6 feet of soil loss. It can absolutely happen. And people, the mental process that's happening in a lot of visitors is often along the lines of, yeah, I mean, I could see how that would be a thing, you know, with tens of thousands of people, but not my horse, not my dog off leash, not my footprints, not my hiking poles. Like, I'm being careful. I'm trying to do the right thing. So it's this process of rationalization we talked about as one of the primary negative impacts of forced and outdoor recreation. People saying, well, okay, that's a thing, but not me. It's sort of the subconscious or preconscious version of the know you, me, right? Rules for thee and not for me. So, a proscriptive descriptive message could put a picture like this and say this was taken a few miles away, which is true, 10,000 feet of elevation away, but a couple of miles away, and just helped sensitize visitors to, hey, if you choose to take your horse here, we don't patrol this area 24/7. You're not under camera surveillance the whole time. You could do this, but you have to understand what you will cause, not other people on other horses, what you will cause. So, in a lot of parks, we see messages just like that. Millions of footprints over the last century have caused this localized ecosystem to become almost completely destroyed. Catch you next time, Libby. And I'll respond to your email too. Okay. And so, please help us preserve this area and restore it to proper ecological function by staying on the trail, by not riding your horse in this area. And by the way, here's this other place, a beach, wherever, that you can ride. We never want to just tell people, no, don't stop. Because by the time they're at the trailhead, if they have no other better option, they're going to do it anyway, right? It's a 6-hour drive to get from those cities over to that Kipahulu Pool area. Okay, cool, exactly. So we have this sense of, all right, for the dry areas, for the wet areas, for all of it, we're up against some difficult problems. We're up against major soil loss. And the issue is, it's not just, oh gosh, this is rocky and rooty and kind of an ugly trail and, this is a tripping hazard, right? Wet, smoothed wood by the passes of thousands of boot soles and so forth. It's very, very slippery, right? So it's an unpleasant experience for your hikers. But just out of frame of this photo here, we've got that stream system. This is looking over sort of a lip, it's about a 50-foot drop at this point, down to Ohio Gulch. And so all of this soil is going into that. Now, it's such a high flow, pulse flow system that soil particles from this area are not silting in that whole stream, like at Ozark Scenic Riverways, for example, where we've got 50 feet of gravel packing into this relatively, what used to be a super fast flowing river. But it is not good for all of the habitat and all of the benthic macroinvertebrates, all of the fishes, all of the birds that want to eat those fishes, and so on and so forth, in this or any other ecosystem that's seeing large inputs in a point source in an intensive, all coming from this spot. So there are plumes of this stuff washing down our streams and rivers, and everything down from those spots gets pretty nuked pretty fast. It's a physical sandpapering effect, rasping microhabitat smooth and gone. It's a physical fill-in process of little dents and hollows underneath the river rock, for example, that get totally covered up in sand and silt and clay particles, and they're just gone. In some cases, even just trapping the benthic macroinvertebrates in there if there's like a real concentrated plume all at once for some reason, like a landslide. Okay? So it's a management choice. It's a strategic choice, or blunder, or boondoggle, or a bad idea, but at a strategic level, to run a path through this area. If we moved it like 50 yards sideways up the slope, could we put another bend in the trail and address this any better? Could we get a whole bunch more of this plastic boardwalking in there over time? Now, these photos are almost 20 years old, right? And the Park Service certainly hasn't fallen asleep on management of this area, so there probably is a whole bunch more boardwalking in this area. But that boardwalking, in order to be rot resistant in this super rainy environment, it's plastic, and microplastics are not good. And plastic is very slippery when wet. So in solving the problem, we might create other problems, right? These roots, slippery when wet. Putting a flat dimensional lumber deck, a boardwalk, up on top of it, slippery when wet. Okay, so we might solve some of the soil transport problem, but we might see an increase, at least short term until we can fix it, in busted ankles. Again, that's a long ambulance ride to give to definitive medical care. So, this is very tricky, right? There are always going to be side effects and consequences to every one of the choices you have to make in this class about how to manage your national park, based on the particular combination of resources and so forth that are present. So what this class is not going to do is penalize you for making hard choices, because that's what we're here to do, right? Not making a choice, letting things sort of run themselves through so-called benign neglect, that's also an option. Just doing nothing. It rarely works out, right? The whole reason that we have management agencies is because if benign neglect mostly worked, we wouldn't have to have management agencies, right? So, be totally unafraid to make bold choices in all of our exercises about all of these different resources as we go through them for the next kind of 8 weeks or so, okay? Because we have to make some bold choices. We have to make some hard trade-offs. We have to come up with some very expensive or difficult to implement things in order to address stuff like this. Because not doing so isn't going to work, isn't going to be good enough. It's violating the trust that the public is putting in you, the agency person, to get good work done. Okay? Cool. So, let's take a look at, this is, I think, the second most bottom or close to the Pacific pool in the Ohio Pools chain. And so you can see a couple of those waterfalls and a bridge up top way in the background. How we actually do management for this particular area works like this. So this kind of process is used all across state and national parks to help us get some kind of concrete data in exactly the same ways and for the same reasons that we're measuring things like species, composition, richness, diversity among our wildlife species at each of these small little sites and zones across our national parks and so forth. We need to get quantitative, actionable information out of our visitors as well to manage this very intensively used human habitat, right? So, this is a simulated photo. We literally headed down or flew down to Maui, rolled out to this area, and spent most of the summer working on this stuff. So you take a bunch of pictures from the exact same spot, and then you use Photoshop or something like that to combine lots of different people into the scene. So we produce a version of this image, and they're all taken from exactly the same perspective. So you're holding constant the site. And what you're varying is the number of people shown in the site. In this case, it's broken out into sort of a, we could call this like a front country zone, very accessible, very close to the trail and so forth. And then a slightly more difficult to access backcountry light zone back here. More rugged. You have to get across the water, you have to walk in the water and so forth. So a lot of visitors are going to stay in this front country area, very easy, very safe. And And the more adventurous visitors are going to get up towards that waterfall where we saw that picture of Chris, the other researcher, and kind of self-sort into these two zones. So we take a bunch of pictures, and then we, as people move around and groups come and go, we take multiple sequences of pictures and combine and airbrush people into and out of these photos, and we present a range of photos to subsequent visitors and ask them, okay, if we show them a picture of 0 people, if this is what you saw as you walk off the trail to Ohio Pools, and you're standing right here in this front country or viewing zone here, if you saw 0 other people, like it shows in this photo, how acceptable would that be to you for crowding? Like, scale of +4, super acceptable, to -4, nope, honey, let's pack up the kids and get out of here right now. Never come back. And then show them 10 people, 20, 30, 50, right? And we've done this exercise, and we build that perception curve, that graph, that S-shaped curve of at 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 people, there's enough space for everybody. It looks like it's not too crowded. 70, 80, 90 people, not so good. It's still worth coming out here, but I'm not really enjoying myself so much. Close to 0 on that +4 to -4 scale. And then upwards of 100 people, 200 people in this. You can absolutely fit 200 people in this view shed right here. Not a problem. It just wouldn't be very pleasant. And it wouldn't have any of that sense of wildness and seclusion and tropical magic like it does with very few people present. So people will respond to that very negatively. And now we know where that graph crosses from positive acceptability to negative unacceptability. And we can run the system. We can close off the number of parking spots to make sure that this place never has more than an acceptable number of people present. Okay? So, we take a totally subjective, individual, kind of nebulous, or even feels like to some people kind of an imaginary impression of how many people is too many people. And then we ask these questions of enough people, a whole bunch of people. It could be hundreds to a few thousand people we get this survey information from. And we just make a graph. And there's no fancy math involved. It's just graphing a bunch of points and drawing a line through averages. Right? We can all run an average for each of these different simulated photos. And then you're not on the hook to figure out anything. You shrink or grow the parking lot to provide an acceptable number of people and not more. And then everybody else that arrives beyond that, they got to figure something else out and go somewhere else, at least for a little while. They can come back later when there's less traffic. Okay? And we should probably also let people know through indirect behavior modification with information and education that, hey, between 10 and 2 p.m., this place is really busy. And we want you to know that because we want you to be happy when you do arrive. So if you don't want to deal with a lot of other people, arrive at 8. Arrive at 3 p.m. You have the whole rest of the afternoon here, and it's a real nice time. The sunset, I bet, would be real pretty. The Pacific Ocean is like 100 yards downstream from here. It's a really, really beautiful spot. Okay? So, we do some on-site control. In this case, maybe flip back to Google Maps here, or Google Earth. Maybe again we are managing the size of the parking lot. Do you see how that's a pretty small parking lot? It's 2 ranks, 50, 60 cars max if people are kind of making a few extra spots, right? So 60 cars, maybe 180 people total. Some folks at the visitor center, maybe 100 or so at the pools a little bit further down, and spread out across that space. That's on purpose. That size of parking lot didn't happen by accident, right? This is not a physical carrying capacity limitation. This parking lot could be 10 times the size of this. In places like Grand Canyon, where they have similarly large flat plateau areas, to stick parking lots, you can have a parking lot that's 50 to 100 times this size, like a Disney-sized parking lot. And South Rim Village is built to handle thousands of people all at once. Kipahulu Pools, which is a conscious, totally arbitrary from some perspective, right? The Park Service could put a 6,000 person parking lot here, but no, 60 will do just fine, thank you very much. Okay? And they set these things based on essentially capture and recapture data. For any of you guys who are wildlife people, we're capturing human visitors with a survey effort and recording some information about their impressions of how many people is too many, and then we release them. And then we capture other visitors and get similar information from them, and so forth. And then we set the physical habitat. In this case, the habitat need is to park instead of to hide from aerial predators like some maybe mammal or even rodent species. Side note, this has nothing to do with anything else. But can you imagine how crazy and aggressive, and some would say just assertive, the rats could be if they got on this island? I mean, some real rats of Nim shit. You guys know rats of Nim? We stayed in research or park housing just down like a couple of 100 yards from here while we were doing this research, and oh my god, the rats were like nothing I've ever seen. Like, just like walking across the countertop, no big deal, you know, in and out, doing their thing. Like crazier than New York subways. I've never seen anything like it. That has nothing to do with anything we're talking about. Whatever. It was still a lot of fun camping here. Okay, so again, just like at the top of the mountain, that wilderness area and that visitor center, you got a visitor center down here. Totally different ecological context. And so the solutions are going to be totally different based on the characteristics of the resource. Those big pools, right? Water is flat. So there's not a lot of anything blocking your view on one side of Ohio Pool to the far side of any of the Ohio pools. And you can see all the other visitors there. Up in the wilderness, you might have a couple other backpackers hidden behind a cinder cone at the far side of the valley, and they're there as well, running at the people at one time, but not the PPV, the people per view shed. And so, functionally speaking, to the person at that PPV, the other hikers don't exist. Okay, so the solutions are going to be different based on the extremely local context, things as small as sight lines and line of sight. Okay, cool. Are we kind of getting a sense for the pattern of what's the resource inventory, what kind of resources and combinations are we dealing with for a particular site? How do people want to use the site based on their motivations and the available activities? What are the dynamics of that use? What kind of impacts or problems could we potentially run into? And then what kind of strategies and therefore tactics do we have available to us to address those dynamics, to address those impacts, to prevent where we can or moderate where we have to, and kind of turn down the heat on any of those impact dynamics. Are we all kind of getting a sense of that? All right, so we've talked through a couple of examples up at the top of the mountain. An example down here at Ohio Gulch, here at the bottom of the mountain. And as we go through these different classes of resources, it's going to shift to contextualizing not for Haleakala National Park in Hawaii, but your chosen national park for the semester. Thinking about, okay, my soil types at the bottom of my slopes at my mountainous national park, they are such and such. So that means I'm going to have to think about hiking in this way, and hiking and equestrian trail riding stuff in the same way for that particular soil type. But way up at the top of the mountain, I don't know if we can get horses up there safely and sustainably, so maybe we're going to zone equestrian activities down at the bottom of the slope and zone on ridgeline stuff, those knife edge ridges, for example. Those are going to have to be backpackers and alpinists only. Unfortunate. But we just can't make that safe for horse and rider, so we're not going to try. Okay? So getting to know the resource, figuring out the dynamics, deciding on not just one tactic, one thing of what we're actually going to do on the ground, but what's kind of a suite of things. And we're going to arrange them from what's probably the first, easiest, quickest, cheapest, least in people's face. I'll use the term least obtrusive, right? So least noticeable by visitors. We don't want visitors to notice our management very much. They're not here to see what we're doing. They're here to enjoy the resources and the opportunities. So we pull together out of our understanding of all the other things upstream, what's the first, cheapest, quickest, easiest, least obtrusive thing I could do? Okay, what's a slightly spicier take I could adopt if that doesn't work? And then what's my nuke it from orbit, it's the only way to be sure option? There's always a nuclear option, and it's usually going to be something like you guys are both saying about limiting use, right? We always kind of go to that as our least desirable option, but it works, right? Cutting out the recreation use stops impacts from recreation pretty definitively, but it's pretty unpopular for valid reasons. Okay? So, let's end a little bit early today since a bunch of our classmates are gone, but moving forward, we're going to move through all these different classes of resources and get all the way through that reasoning process of, get to know the resource, think about the motivations and dynamics, impacts, all the way to what's my ordered list of 1, 2, 3 tactics on site, so that when the next year's visitor season rolls around, we got our plan in place, and depending on how things go, we greenlight tactic 1, or we greenlight tactic 1 and we're ready to go on tactic 2, or man, things were so bad last year, we're just jumping straight to 3. Nuclear option. Okay? Cool. All right, I'm around for questions if you have them. Again, we've started posting a bunch of the classroom recordings on the YouTube channel. Those are going to be in the park management playlist on YouTube, so if you're not sure where those are, jump on YouTube and Google for Logan Park and forestry, and those will come up. See you on Wednesday, but not Friday. But I never see you guys on Friday, so it's okay. Thanks, guys.